You know, Judy and I have been working closely together for many months to bring this program to you, and I have some housekeeping requests for this evening's presentation. You will be muted by our host for the entire program, as it will be recorded. Please help us to facilitate this so that everyone will be able to hear and enjoy tonight with equal opportunity. Now, speaking of the sound quality, some of the audio clips that we had gathered that you will be hearing tonight will require you to raise the volume on your devices, as they are not easy to hear without you doing so. So you may wish to adjust the volume on your device now to accommodate that. And you may also wish to check to see if your Zoom screen is on the speaker view. And if it isn't, you can change that by moving your mouse to the 9 dots at the top right of your screen, whereupon if you click that icon, you will see that you have a choice between gallery and speaker views. And if you shift it to the speaker view, each time a presenter appears, you will be able to have a much larger image of the person on your screen. Now, although you will be muted throughout the program, please feel free to comment or communicate either to every single one of us or privately in the chat section, which you will also find in the listed icons on the bottom of your screen, should you wish. But at the end of the program, you are welcome then at that time to switch from speaker to gallery view and add some time. There will be additional time for family and friends to have a visit then. So that will be an opportunity to get some talk time in. Now, you know, it is with huge gratitude that Judy and I thank firstly Sandra Lipton for stepping in tonight, who is president, of course, of our organization, who is helping out with our PowerPoint presentation that our dear office staff created. And Sandra, you know, you are a lifesaver. Secondly, deep gratitude goes out to both Sheldon Smithens and Harry Sanders for moderating this tribute tonight. When I attended Manny's unveiling, just before the service began, I just happened to glance to my right, and lo and behold, before my eyes, I saw Mr. Canadian Picker, past president of the Jewish Historical Society of Alberta himself, Sheldon Smithens, in a very deep conversation with our very own Harry the historian, standing together. You know, I call that an aha moment. Call it a prompting, maybe from Manny of blessed memory, certainly from Hashem. In my mind, there would be no two more perfect individuals in their own right, from my point of view, to honor Manny. Unfortunately, when I approached them, without a moment of hesitation, they said yes. So without further ado,
good evening. My name is Sheldon Smithens, and I share the moderating this evening with my good friend, the notable historian Harry Sanders. It's no coincidence that the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta secured February 17th to pay tribute to our beloved and cherished longstanding member of our board, Manny Cohen. He actually would have celebrated his 92nd birthday on this very day. Simply said, no other day would suffice. Our program this evening doesn't even begin to unpack the depth and breadth, the scope of this brilliant, entrepreneurial, philanthropical, community-minded, and historically driven neshama, or soul. He was a man for all seasons and dearly loved and appreciated by all whose paths he graced.
Many family members and friends from all over have stepped forward to contribute numerous anecdotes, photos, articles, artifacts, memorabilia, and precious memories that actually warrant a Manny Cohen series of programming to do justice to the life and times of this remarkable son. Forgot to turn my humidifier off. Husband, father, grandfather, businessman, visionary, friend, lifelong learner, and teacher. Before we begin to give you a fleeting essence of the man, we wish to thank all of those who have contributed to the avalanche and bounty of information that the Historical Society now has to draw from. At the end of this program, the credits will list all of the amazing people who have contributed to make this evening happen. However, we would be remiss if we did not thank Jeffrey and Michael Cohen, Manny's sons, for the endless hours and collation of all the photos and documentation they provided. It was and is staggering. Our program brings together many people's memories of Manny. Memory has intrinsic limitations, and in spite of everyone's best efforts, some of the stories in our program may not perfectly match the historical record. Manny's parents were Hyman Cohen and Mary Goldenberg, who were married in 1924, their celebration being held at the Isis Theater. Hyman was doing very well for himself, as illustrated by the newlyweds having magnificent cold weather attire during their first year of marriage. Manny was the third of 4 children, his sister Annette and his 2 brothers, Samuel and Maurice. He was raised mainly in Calgary and Lethbridge. One of Manny's earliest memories in Calgary was photo day at the Talmud Torah on 18th Avenue and Center Street. In Bertha Gold's transcription, Manny said, "I can remember coming home from kindergarten in Mr. Hapton's car. If you got in early, you had kids piled all over you. And if you got in late, you were on top of the pile." Those are early memories from Calgary. Summers were always spent on the farm and ranch.
One of Manny's earliest memories of his younger years on the ranch was his first Shetland pony, Danny, an old circus pony who, if you tapped his forelegs, would kneel down. Manny and his siblings diligently did their chores, but would much rather go out and play and ride their horses. Manny remembers his early days in Lethbridge. The first summer, it was Sam's bar mitzvah. Manny knew so few people and remembered going to shul. It was just packed. He met more of his peers and soon settled into enjoying the life in Lethbridge. In preparing for his own bar mitzvah, Manny found that he was influenced by the teacher and rabbi at the parochial school, Rabbi Avil, who later moved to Saskatoon. In the summers, the family always invited other family members to come. Emmanuel felt it was harder when the older cousins came because he was pushed in the background, but they certainly had nice evenings and friendly times.
Manny's younger cousin, Dan Gordon, says, "Cousin Emmanuel was such a larger-than-life presence when I was a kid. My dad was Manuel's father, Hyman's brother. So Manuel and Sam and Morris, the youngest Cohen brother, and my late brother David and I were all first cousins. My dad married late in life and was 52 when I was born, which explains the big age difference between us. So Manuel and Sam and Morris were always the big brothers. They were adults when we were kids. We would come up to the ranch almost every summer, sometimes to Clarendale and sometimes to Pincher Creek. Uncle Hyman supplied bucking stock to the Calgary Stampede, so we got to see the rodeo from the chutes and live in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. So it was sort of every boy's dream."
Manny's high school years were spent in Lethbridge and being very involved in sports, especially shooting, gymnastics, skiing, and football. The March 15, 1947 Lethbridge Herald says, and I quote, "Emmanuel Cohen doing front flips aided by ski poles? This guy can stand more punishment." It would be many, many years of hard working and hard playing until Manny's activities caught up to him in the 1960s. And he had to take things down a few notches to normal levels from superhuman. Emmanuel was involved in many local activities. Long before his time with the Jewish Seniors Voices Choir, Manny was a member of the cadets and was in the band. He played clarinet, saxophone, and on occasion, the drums. Though in typical Manny style, he would often place the emphasis where he felt it was best suited.
In his early years and beyond, he worked on his family's ranches near Pincher Creek, the Porcupine Hills, and the Little Bow. Manny remembers his father racing horses not only in Canada, yet also in the US, and participating actively, either going to the races, writing stories about his father's horses, and doing his fair share of riding it himself. It was a family affair, very occasionally encountering some anti-Semitism. For the most part, the experience and interaction was quite positive. Hyman flew his blue and white Magen David proudly on his jockey and horse silks. The family and stable crew warmly sent out, quote, season's greetings cards to the broader community long before ecumenical sensitivity and inclusion was a thing. A winner never quits, a quitter never wins. Hyman, quote, felt quite proud that he was a Jew and had as good a livestock as anyone else.
Manny left Lethbridge and the ranches to attend university in Oklahoma on his motorcycle, and in his words said, "I was going to an American college to play football, yet he ended up taking geology. Yes, but at the time, in our geology classes, there were so many Canadian boys, mostly from Alberta. Most of them were military veterans, and it was the same time that Leduc oil fields blew in. They all went to take their courses at Oklahoma, and I developed many Alberta friends. It was very challenging. I was taking geology. I never graduated because in the middle of my studies, my father was in a train accident. I came home to help run the farm and ranches. I thought that it was just as important as getting a university degree. My father survived his train accident. Although Emmanuel never completed that degree, he always continued his search for knowledge and to expand his horizons. He eventually went on to become a steam engineer, third class, a licensed realtor, an appraiser, a large vehicle driver, a hotel operator, and even an in-house chef. They were among his great many hats that he wore.
That's when Manny became a pilot. He states, I was about 21, and because my father had branched out, we had ranches all over southern Alberta. I couldn't get around to them fast enough, so I took up flying. I purchased an airplane. I got my pilot's license. I'm a chartered member of the Flying Farmers of Alberta. In 1948, I got my license. In the wintertime, we flew on skis, and I'm not bragging, but I could just about land anywhere on the skis. I now ask Shari to speak personally in her own words.
I've been thinking a lot about my Uncle Manuel, Amy, as I call him, and have a few stories to share. As you know, he was a kind and generous man with a huge heart. He also had an amazing mind for historic details, whether it be family or Alberta history. He was our guy. As a child, I thought he was literally a giant. He was not just big from my child-sized view, but he towered over the adults too. In the photo of the Triumph motorcycle, it makes it look like a kid's bicycle. He rode that bike down to Oklahoma when he went to university in 1948. One of the other traits that Amy had was the ability to find adventure. Andy Russell once told me that an adventure is just a plan gone bad. I wish I had asked him about his drive down to Oklahoma, since he probably had an adventure or two to tell. In the next photo I added, Amy and I had taken a trip down to visit our friend Aaron Thrall's family ranch, the McIntyre Ranch, in 2015. It's on the Milk River Ridge just south of McGrath. I don't know if this is of any interest to you, but you said you also wanted some family history, and this is linked to the McIntyre Ranch. This story is from the 40s, when my Zeta, Hyman Cohen, was a cattle buyer for Patrick Burns. Billy McIntyre was a friend of my grandfather's and asked him to select a carload of cattle to be shipped to Seattle for an agricultural fair. The whole carload was recognized as superior stock and put the McIntyre Ranch on the map for their breeding program. As a special thank you, Billy McIntyre gave him his full-length buffalo coat. The story goes that because of this coat, Hyman was able to withstand the cold longer than his competitor buyers at the outdoor livestock auctions. They were held all over southern Alberta. The advantage of that was when the others could no longer stand the winter cold, they would head inside to warm up. But the auctioneer, well, he just kept on going, which meant that there were often fewer bidders for the cows, and Hyman got some very good deals. As you know, Amy never threw anything out, and so he decided to donate the coat to the Galt Museum. Actually, it was only part of the coat. It was a beautiful coat that was custom made for Billy McIntyre out west. Beaver collar and cuffs and full-length buffalo hide, which must have weighed a ton. Amy said that sometime in the 50s, they made it shorter and turned the bottom half into chaps. He found them just a few years ago, but it sounded like they were very stiff and perhaps they would be better as stovepipes. The cowboy hat that I'm wearing used to sit in the back window of his old car. He was always a bit of a cowboy touch with him, either his string ties or his cowboy buckles on his belts or his suspenders. His most favorite buckle was the one with the chai on it, which he's wearing in this photo. Amy had a great sense of humor and loved to prank. In our modern times, some of these pranks would be considered not politically correct or perhaps mean, but those were different times, and folks were, I suppose, thicker skinned. In the photo taken in the barn, you'll see an anvil, which of course triggered a story of Shorty. Shorty was aptly named and wanted to prove he was capable of working on the Cohen Ranch. The men, Amy included, told Shorty that the blacksmith was coming and that the anvil needed to be taken out of the barn and brought out into the yard so that the smithy could see better in the bright sunlight. Shorty dutifully went into the barn and carried that very, very, very heavy anvil out into the yard. And I'm sure he gained much respect from the crew after they'd stopped laughing at the joke they played on him. As a small child, Amy and I were sharing some chalva, and I looked up at him and I said, "What's this made of?" He told me, "Ground up camel's bones." That was the last time I touched that stuff for many, many years. Remember that the tin had a camel image on it, and so I totally believed him. Another story that I like to share was when he or my father Sam would take their father in the Piper Pacer plane. Hyman always told them to fly low and slow. He hated flying, but sure enjoyed arriving so quickly to their destination. They called the plane a tail dragger, because they took the front wheel off, which sat directly under the propeller, and stuck a small wheel on the tail so that they could land on bumpy fields and not do a nosedive. He was a very, very dear uncle to us all and a keeper of a family history. I hope one day Michael and Jeffrey will find time to get you more information, which I'm sure there's still piles. He had stacks and stacks of photos and was putting together a booklet on the Cohen ranches. He was a wonderful man and I miss him dearly. Now I'll end with the only Yiddish saying that I know, which Amy loved to use, and he made sure that I learned it. Azoy gets.
Shari, as a niece and member of his family, having you participate in tonight's program is a gift to us all. And here's a short clip of Manny explaining to Shari about one of the family's brands.
They're brothers-in-law to Ken Hilbert.
Yeah.
Well, the newbies are old comers to Canada. Their relatives came up with the Mormons from Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm.
This would be in about 1895 or so. And their cattle brand came from Salt Lake City. It was Horseshoe Bar. They registered it in Canada, and money was tight in about 1940. My dad was dealing with Newbie, and he bought I think he paid $100, which was unheard of at that time for that brand.
And these are special because there are only two brands. Like they got much more complicated, and they were so they were more valuable when they're a two-part brand. Cool.
Dan Gordon shared another fond memory of his summer visits with big cousin Emmanuel, who utilized a very unusual manual flying instrument.
Well, I remember Emmanuel taking me up in one of the Piper Cubs, and there was a hole in the dash where I guess there had been a gauge of some kind and it had taken out. And Emmanuel said, "Do you want to fly the plane?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, because, man, it would be great." He said, "Just stick your finger in that hole, and however you turn your finger, the plane's going to turn." So I finger in the hole, and I started turning it, and of course he started banking the plane left, right. I said, "What are you doing? You're going to crash us. I'm losing control of the plane." I started crying. "I don't know what I'm doing."
Thank you, Dan, for sharing your initial flying training with us. Shari shared another flying memory. Manny was up in Edmonton and was flying back to Calgary, and somehow he turned the map around upside down, so he was watching the map, and suddenly the mountains were on the wrong side, and he realized, uh-oh, and he turned it around in time. Flight navigation equipment was much more manual when Emmanuel was in the air. Under Manny's and often Sam's steerage, the family plane flew many miles, often on the same day, flying not just the family and farm workers around, but also visiting dignitaries and local politicians and friends who couldn't possibly otherwise fulfill their extremely filled schedules in a single day. When Israeli Shimon HaKohen came in 1950 to raise awareness of the young state's need for help in raising funds for support, Emmanuel and his father volunteered to help the Israeli delegate meet all his deadlines and maximize his tour potential. When family friend and briefly business partner, Mayor of Medicine Hat, Harry Viner, needed to speak in Medicine Hat, Empress, and Lethbridge, all in the same day, Hyman volunteered Emmanuel to fly the Whirlwind Tour, touching down on the baseball diamond mid-game. The players and fans didn't mind the timeout so much. They were glad to hear Mayor Viner speak about his promise to come to their aid by supplying them with the necessary train cars so they could ship their grain to market. Relieved to hear that the politician would support them, the Empress locals happily resumed their game as Emmanuel flew off with the mayor to the next engagement in Lethbridge. Manny utilized that plane like a storehouse, especially in the wintertime, flying food to their neighbors who wouldn't otherwise be able to get to supplies. One neighbor in particular was so appreciative of Emmanuel's efforts that in 1951, he gave Manny a 1928 Model A Ford car that the farmer had noticed Manny admiring for years over their shared fence line. Manny really was heading out in grand style.
Manny didn't limit his work to the ranch holdings, which were all over southern Alberta, including the Clarendale farm. Manny tells us, "Then we bought one of the larger irrigation farms of Alberta. It was the Clarendale Stock Farms. It was really a showpiece." Hyman urged Sam to leave the oil business and come help out with the expanding family ranching network. At their peak, the family had 275,000 acres scattered in different places. Sam and the family resided at the Clarendale Stock Farm, and Manny moved from place to place as the seasons changed. Sometime in the 1990s, Manny and his cousin Ben Goldenberg, Jeanette Berger's brother, were looking at their photo albums, reminiscing about the olden days and sharing their memories.
That's the last roundup. We had sold the cattle, we'd sold the ranch in Drumheller, and it took us 6.5 days to trail the cattle from Drumheller across the prairie, and we ended up in Vauxhall. It's about 150 miles, and there were a lot of young heifers that were they raised or bore calves on that trip, and we had to have an old hayrack and a team, and as they birthed the calves, we loaded them on the hayrack, and that was quite a feat getting the cattle there, and my dad is there. You can see sorting them out.
Ben, who considered himself a city slicker, remembers pitching in when he'd come to visit, visiting the animals, mucking out the stalls. He eventually upgraded from that chore to be the stone bolt water carrier. But none in the know filled him in that he had to grease the skid, so he was having to work way too hard. Before the days of Xbox, cousins used to play pranks on each other for mutual amusement. Ben remembered the motto, no stooking, no eating. Times have changed. Throughout the early part of the 1950s, foot and mouth disease epidemic changed the fortunes of most, and in the face of agriculture throughout the area. Whole herds were culled, and ranchers and feedlots alike were hit hard. Manny believed the veterinarian who diagnosed hoof and mouth disease committed suicide because he had made a terrible mistake diagnosing. They later believed the cattle had gotten into and eaten thistle and that it was not hoof and mouth disease. By all accounts, Hyman Cohen was not a tall man, but he was always a person of considerable stature. He was a sporting man, a man's man who could take what he was dealt. In his younger days, he was bucked off a bronc at Natton. He had a broken leg, which was not set well, and he limped the rest of his life and walked with a cane. He survived the train accident that brought Emmanuel back from university, but when he had a stroke in his declining health inevitably prevented him from continuing on with the business of ranching. Coupled with Hyman's health concerns, foot and mouth disease essentially wiped out the once vast Cohen ranching operation and feedlot business. As per the family determination, the Cohen brothers picked themselves up by their bootstraps and found another door of opportunity to first build and then open the Alberta Dehydrating Company. Most of the grazing holdings were soon liquidated, and all the efforts were put into the alfalfa dehydrating and pelleting plant in Vauxhall.
It was the second dehydrating plant in Canada. Manny goes on to say, it was a marvelous co-venture with the government. My dad had a lot of close friends among the social credit government. Eventually, after 8 or 9 years, I became sick, and what had happened, we were processing winter seeds. I developed dicumarol poisoning. It's developed through bacteria and rotting mold. It was a year before I married, and Donna was with me. Because of personal health problems in 1966, Manny could not work in the mill. Like many couples, Emmanuel Cohen and Donna Perlman met at a community simcha. Lou Perlman, Donna's father, came with his family to Lethbridge to celebrate his nephew David Hamer's bar mitzvah. Emmanuel remembered Donna, and during his visits to Calgary met her again, and eventually they got engaged. At the time Manny married Donna, he was 34, and they lived in Vauxhall for another couple of years until they moved back to Calgary, or in Manny's words, eventually after I recovered from my sickness, we moved to Calgary, and it was my city time. It was 1960. First, I didn't know what I was going to do. Then I went into real estate, and I got into the commercial farms and ranches, and it was not an easy transition for a country bumpkin. So I went out selling farms, and I found it very, very interesting. Then in the commercial end, I was trying to sell hotels and motels. It was in the early 1960s that Manny approached Lucien Lieberman, who was then a business loan analyst with the IDB, Industrial Development Bank in Calgary, whereupon his dream of developing a ski destination resort in the backcountry near Canmore and west of Pincher Creek was first germinated. Lucien, like Manny and his friend Jay Joffe, loved skiing, and they often visited Jay's A-frame cabin in Canmore and enjoyed the social life that went with the skis. The loan didn't come to fruition through the IDB. However, according to Lucien, Manny knew enough people to help make this dream a reality, and he and Donna and Sam and G bought their first motel in Waterton Lakes. Manny explains, then we had a second motel there. Our children were born and raised in the motels, and they were really raised in the motel spirit in the summer resort of Waterton. We had 2 boys.
Gary Kahn from Lethbridge remembers the Waterton motel experience and more. Gary?
What a guy. I would like to share with you 2 distinct memories of the time with Amy that I will never forget. The first was skiing with him at Sunshine Village during the years 63 to 65. Can't remember exactly when I was attending Mount Royal College in Calgary. We had experienced a wonderful day of skiing with a larger group, but the light was getting flat by mid-afternoon. As many of you know, he was fearless on his skis, and even though he was a large man, was extremely competent and agile at downhill skiing. But when the light is flat and there is little contrast, it's difficult to see the terrain. Most of us had yellow goggles to increase the contrast, but Amy did not. As was his style, he said, just one more run for the day. Going hell-bent for leather, thinking he was Jean-Claude Keely, he came barreling down the slope, hit a mogul the wrong way, and took the nastiest of falls. We called for the ski patrol, and down came Manny on the toboggan and whisked off to the Mineral Springs Hospital in Banff. That pretty much ended our day as well, and it was off to Banff to see him. He had torn the ligaments in his knee and thought he would never walk or ski again. But thanks to a great orthopedic surgeon who had just learned the newest techniques in reattaching ligaments, it was but a year or 2 later before he was back on the slopes again, but this time with a little more caution. A second memory was with the Cohen family in Waterton. We would often go to Waterton for the day to enjoy the park and the friendship with the Cohen brothers, Manny and Sam. Sam and Guy owned the Emerald Bay Resort, and Manny and Donna had the Waterton bungalows. We usually gathered at the bungalows, and on this particular day, July the 20th, 1969, the families, plus a few other guests, and Linda and I were gathered around a small black and white TV in Manna and Donnie's living room quarters on the backside of the office, watching the first lunar moon landing. In Waterton, the TV reception in those days was marginal, to say the least. But with some tinfoil wrapped around the antenna, we were able to have as decent a picture as possible of Neil Armstrong taking his first steps on the moon. I'm sure that the geschreit and cheers that we let out were heard over the entire town site. There wasn't a time that Amy and Donna came to Lethbridge that they didn't stop or call by. I also shared with Amy his love for antique cars. What a guy to remember.
Thank you, Gary, for adding your memories of Manny from down south. Manny was at one time the president of the Waterton Chamber of Commerce. At that time, in the early 70s, the federal government changed the basis for land ownership in the national parks, and all the owners were concerned. It changed from leases in perpetuity to non-renewable leases. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was in Waterton, and Manny, as president of the chamber, apparently presented him with an honorary membership in the chamber in perpetuity at a ceremony at the Prince of Wales Hotel. Very tongue-in-cheek, and that was Manny. In his words, we sold the motels very successfully and moved to Calgary. And I was back to real estate and going to school, taking the appraisal courses. Manny didn't stop there. He also bought another resort motel in the Lake Louise area while continuing his career in real estate and appraisals. Michael recalls, Manny took chef courses over winters at SAIT when he owned the Baker Creek Motel in Banff. The motel was seasonal, summer only, and he filled winters with working in Calgary and going to school in the evenings. His thought was that knowing more about cooking would help with the small restaurant that was run from the main lodge at the motel. Somewhere I have his chef hat. We remember he would come home from school with fancy breads and fruit pieces baked in. Also, he would thereafter carve turkeys for all the holidays. And in the beautiful manner he learned at cooking school, he had a fancy carving knife and steel. Pretty arcane stuff at the time. I learned to carve turkeys from him. Manny also obtained a Class 1 large vehicle driver's license. Not sure exactly when, maybe in connection with the ranches or Vauxhall. I know he spent some time driving trucks for Weirmouth Construction to pick up some work in the winter. Reflecting on the Baker Creek Motel in Lake Louise, Manny recalled, sure, it was a great place to have a hotel, but when the kids went back, it wasn't much fun for them. So eventually we sold that, and I was back to the city on a full-time basis again. Worked in real estate and appraising for many years. Michael recalls, when Dad started in real estate as a broker, I believe it was Melton Real Estate, he worked with Leo Friedman. He later said that Leo was the smartest guy of the whole bunch. When all the fellows would go out for lunch, Leo would stay back and answer the phones, always getting more business.
The appraisal business was a family affair. Donna took the same courses as Manny, and she was very much part of his work throughout his career. And even Michael worked alongside his parents for a short time. In addition to Manny's extensive and diversified professional life, his love for history, especially Jewish history, was one of the passions that nurtured his soul. Trudy Cowan shared this passion with Manny, and because she's currently in Mexico, she's unable to speak personally, so I'll do so on her behalf. She said, and this is Trudy, I first met Manny in the 1970s on the ski slopes. Lake Louise, Mount Norquay, and Sunshine Village were all enjoyed, as I recall. Gathering afterward for drinks and music in the bar at the Timberline Hotel, now called the Juniper Lodge, was a favorite. He was an excellent, fearless skier, always laughing and shouting as he raced us all down the hill. Over the years, I knew and visited with Manny and Donna occasionally, and always enjoyed conversations that included tales of his family's involvement in ranching and small town life in many parts of Alberta. Since I was working in the museum and historic sites world at Glenbow and then Fort Calgary, and since Manny lived Alberta history, it was only natural that we both became involved with Jay Joffe in the earliest discussions about the JHSSA. Both of us served on the board for a number of years. Manny knew Southern Alberta and always seemed to have personal connections to families, stories, and communities, Jewish and beyond. Irina Karchenbaum began a project for including a synagogue at Heritage Park. Irina knew of my background in heritage preservation and brought me into the project. I, in turn, introduced her to our community's historian, Jack Switzer, Zachor Latov, and it was Jack who insisted to Irina that she speak to Manny Cohen, Zachor Latov, as he was someone whose roots were from the area of the Jewish farming colonies, an important person to have on our committee. Jack, Zachor Latov, had written a couple of articles for the Discovery newsletter about the Montefiore Institute. These articles contained the basic information for building a replica of the Montefiore Institute at Heritage Park, which Manny suggested could be done in the original proposal to Heritage Park. When Heritage Park approved the project, Manny got curious. He decided to drive out one day to Hannah to visit the local museum. Using Jack's research, Manny for years had suspected the lost Montefiore Institute was at Hannah. Apparently, the museum's director happened to be in that day. Manny asked if the man knew anything about a building that was built as a synagogue in 1916 out on a prairie homestead near Sibbald and was reputed to have been moved to Hannah. Did it still exist? The director, according to Manny's telling of the story, laughed, turned around to a photograph on the wall right behind his desk, and pointed to the very building in question. It is now a house at, and he gave Manny the address and the name of the family who then owned it. Manny was always so proud of having found the little synagogue. We visited it at Hannah a few times and even were invited inside by the tenant and allowed to climb up into the attic that still had much of the synagogue's original ceiling. From his experience as a real estate appraiser, Manny said he knew it was movable and restorable even before the restoration architects and structural engineers studied the building and reported that it was. And then a small group of us, including Manny, of course, were there when the building was lifted onto huge steel beams on wheels, was moved off its foundation, and headed out of town toward Calgary. We visited the building when it spent almost a year as at a feedlot south of Strathmore while the exterior restoration was undertaken. Manny kept a close eye on his building. And then we were all at Calgary's southern city limits as the little synagogue set off in a parade. Police cars, 2 of the moving company trucks, the truck hauling the synagogue itself, NMAX trucks to ensure no wires were in the way, and a few of our cars because we couldn't not be there for this last road trip toward and into Heritage Park. Manny watched and encouraged every stage of the building's progress, and his joy at the opening in August 2009 was touching to see. But he didn't stop there. For most of the years since then, he was part of the interpretive team, telling stories of finding the building, its restoration, Jewish history in the West, and more. Visitors loved meeting him and hearing Manny tell his tales. Manny is missed.
Trudy, Irina Karchenbaum, and Leslie Levant all shared overlapping memories of Manny's involvement with the little synagogue. Irina added, "With Manny no longer with us, I think he would want everyone to know that he was the person who actually found the original Montefiore Institute and helped change the project from building a replica to restoring the original Montefiore Institute." Irina states, "Manny became my friend and we were friends to the end of his days. We would go for lunch at Phil's or 1600, speak on the phone regularly, and always kibitz at the JCC. I still can't believe I can't pick up the phone to call him." Thank you, Trudy and Irina, for giving this precious insight as to how extensive Manny's involvement was in bringing our little synagogue to Calgary. Manny's volunteer work included involvement with the war veterans. He loved singing with the Calgary Jewish Community Choir, and he went to shul regularly. Judy Chetner has many heartfelt memories of his participation. Judy?
Manny and Donna were amongst the founding members of Voices Jewish Seniors Choir, and both loved to sing. I don't know whether his musical late mother-in-law, Edith Perlman, had anything to do with coaxing out his ability, or whether singing came naturally to him. But Manny certainly had a beautiful voice for singing as well as for storytelling. Thankfully, Manny had outgrown his cadet era tendency to put the emphasis where he felt like putting it. He was always on pitch and on time with his choir mates. Musical time, that is. Manny's varied interests and commitments often caused some overlap and intersection between his worlds, circles, and schedules. Aside from spending time with Manny every Wednesday at choir practice and the kibbutz, often a meal that invariably followed, we got to spend time together many minyanim and almost every Shabbat at shul. As Rabbi Russ has mentioned, it was notable how comfortable Manny was at shul. He often would camp out there, making himself quite at home while waiting for minyan, occasionally startling other attendees as he would rise from the couch where he had been resting, waiting for someone else to show up. Manny always had glowing reviews after services of how the laner laned, how the davener davened. He appreciated the old traditional tunes, enjoyed hearing newer tunes, and especially got a kick out of those times when the davener would go freeform and sing to their own tunes. Manny always appreciated a free spirit. Manny reveled in Yiddishkeit. He enjoyed all aspects of the Jewish community and constantly sought to learn more about, to experience, and to live and carry on the traditions of his heritage. He participated in every event, class, and chag he could fit into his busy schedule, always grateful for everything he could learn and experience. From learning to lay in Haftarah with Mark Levin after shul, to brushing up on his Yiddish with Sabra Marcus in the Yiddish Club, to catching every movie at the Jewish Film Festival and attending every concert, chazak program, and lecture, Manny was always fully present. He greatly appreciated every article written in the synagogue and community newspapers. Just as he loved sharing his knowledge and stories, he loved hearing and reading about other people's knowledge, experiences, and efforts to build and support the community. He was truly thankful for each and every person who contributed to the community in any way. What obviously made Manny happiest, though, was his family. The loss of his dearest Donna of blessed memory left a gaping hole in his life. He bravely soldiered on, dear friends by his side, many of whom had themselves recently suffered life-changing losses. He filled his time with widely varied activities about which he was passionate, and with great friends with whom he shared common interests. But we have never seen Manny happier than when his family was around. He loved it when a son, daughter-in-law, or grandchild would join him at shul. He beamed when he could share an aliyah with a loved one on the bima. He felt and shep nachas at sharing every one of his family's musical, sporting, academic, personal, or professional achievements. On his birthday Shabbat, when his family was all there surrounding him, he was radiant, truly glowing with happiness, fulfillment, and pride. In years, we had never seen him happier. We will miss him and treasure memories of the times we got to share, always.
Thank you, Judy, for these precious words. Manny was indeed very involved in the Jewish communities of Southern Alberta, but he was also involved in many other sectors of our broader community. He was president of the Vauxhall Chamber of Commerce, and then again, the Waterton Chamber of Commerce. He was on the National Parks Land Use Committee, and Emmanuel was a long-standing devoted member, and for 2 years, president of the Motel Owners Association. He was also president of the Appraisal Institute of Canada. During his time with the Waterton Chamber of Commerce, Manny piloted a plan to traverse from Glacier National Park in Montana to Waterton to create a usable road for locals and tourism. This extremely rugged backcountry had only been navigated on horseback, the perfect challenge for, well, you know who. Manny organized a 4-wheel convoy on the roller coaster ride of a lifetime, including some 15 river crossings. An exhilarating adventure for all, and Manny cavilled in his own words, "It was a dream come true. Maybe next year it'll be faster." It was hoped that the next year there would be a trip to open up the Waterton to Crow's Nest and Fernie areas, and the plans just kept on coming. Michael recalls, at one time, Manny had a carved up Volkswagen Beetle. It was done up for off-roading. Air-cooled engine, metal skid plates underneath, no doors, a roll bar, and floor drains, which he may have used on that trip. I remember it in our driveway as a kid. We took it to a place in Midnapore to get it repaired, and it was stolen. So that was the end of that. Manny held that in the summer, people are gypsies. They'll follow any road. And Manny was always game to create some new ones. Manny and his motorcade activists and enthusiasts may not have fulfilled their intentions of opening up an easy access to and connecting their regions of mutual backcountries, but Emmanuel and his families were not without their impact on the landscape.
Cohen family always had good connections and relations with the community as a whole and with the governing bodies that served them. Like his father, Hyman, before him, Manny always had a healthy working relationship with local and regional powers that be, as well as the local populations and farmers. Hyman and Emmanuel and Sam made their way for the Little Bow Provincial Park and Traverse Dam Irrigation Reserve through their ceding of the Little Bow ranch land to the government for this project, which helped to develop a greater amount of irrigated farms, ranging from Lamond, Travers, Vauxhall, Enchant, and Hayes. Hyman, who had learned from his friend Alderman Frank Fries that there were always opportunities around the corner, was able to move from business into new business, trading his way into new opportunities. Emmanuel, likewise, moved deftly from one phase of his life into the next as needed. He and Donna always made the best of every situation and change with grace and style. Manny did appraising work and consulting for the purchase/expropriation of land, either for government taking the land or owners whose land was being taken, perhaps covering both sides, in order to move progress forward and, at the same time, give the little guy a fair shake. Manny helped shape the local and regional landscape into the creation of the transportation corridor around Calgary, or the Ring Road as it has become. So many of us can point to the ways that Manny affected our lives positively, and I'm one of them. For years, Manny did appraisals for my father's apartment buildings. When the time came, he advised us on the probable future date when the upkeep of the buildings would overtake their profitability for us. His advice guided us on what eventually became one of our family's most important business decisions. Manny and Donna were very involved in the Model A and Model T automobile associations and car clubs. When you would get to where the car club group was meeting, it was always like driving through an historic town, like being on a film set. A niece, Cheryl Kerr Laughlin, shares, and I'm quoting her, "Another passion of Manny's that also had historical significance was his Model A. We loved meeting Manny and Donna when they went to Model A conventions near us. Both he and Donna were always dressed in full period costumes, which Donna had sewn. Manny spent much of his time servicing the car and sourcing parts, as it always needed more service and parts. He, of course, talked to everyone while he serviced the car and tried to source parts. He had a miniature Model A that he built and brought for Jamie and Spencer to race, wanting them to have fun. He also made sure we were there for the ice cream socials, which was, of course, a hit with the boys. The ice cream socials were always a wonderful way to accentuate a car ride and were a hit with travelers of all ages."
Manny was a collector, not only of people, stories, and artifacts, also antique cars, but not trailer queens. Why not trailer queens, you ask? Because they are kept in such beautiful shape, hardly driven, tarped in the winter, shaded from the bright summer sun, fussed over, polished, and preened more than a poodle at the Westminster Dog Show, said Joanne Elves of the Calgary Herald. Manny Cohen's 1928 Model A Phaeton, which was never mothballed, rusted out, or forgotten behind the fence. Manny's car managed to putt along the long and bumpy roads of auto history with scratches, dents, fake roadkill, and crazy add-ons, exactly how Manny and Donna liked it, said Elves. Apparently, Manny, growing up on a farm near Hannah, watched this 1928 Model A sand-colored convertible Phaeton from across the fence. He nicknamed his beauty, held together with twist ties and love, Old Velcro, and it stuck. Unlike the stuffy trailer queens, Manny's car won many awards. You guessed it. It won time and time again for the People's Choice Award. This car was no ordinary car. It wasn't only the People's Choice awarded car, it was the very car that Manny drove all over Alberta and courted and proposed to Donna in. Thereafter, taking them on hundreds of family picnics, teaching Jeffrey and Michael how to drive a standard engine, and yes, taking friends to funerals and to weddings. There was nothing quite like hitting the road for Donna and Emmanuel.
Manny and Donna loved their involvement with the 1988 Olympics. Manny was a volunteer. His role was that of a shuttle bus driver. He met many dignitaries, athletes, and coaches from all around the world. He loved his time spent driving around his various charges, and he especially relished in sharing anecdotes about his experiences with Eddie the Eagle and the Jamaican bobsled team. Manny was disappointed when Calgary did not succeed with the bid to have the Olympics return to our city and area. Eventually, Manny got the opportunity himself to enjoy the thrill of the bobsled. As much as Donna may have tamed his wilder side throughout his life, Manny always held that you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. Though Manny may have somewhat lowered his threshold for risk tolerance once becoming a family man, he was still always one to seek out adventure and be innovative and write his own rule book. It is a pleasure to have his two sons, Michael and Jeffrey, recall how their father lived on the edge. Michael and Jeffrey will tell us about how Manny never argued a case against his limitations. Michael, you go first.
Thank you, Harry. I would like to share with you this evening a couple stories of what I like to call the 9 lives of Manny Cohen. Manny had, over his years, a few notable adventures, or perhaps you would call them misadventures or close calls, or maybe even near misses. But in any case, I think he used up much more than his share of his 9 lives. So let me start with a story about Emmanuel's garage. Sometime in the late 1990s, Emmanuel decided it was time to redo the roof on his detached garage. The old red brick house where they lived had outbuildings, which really were an artifact of the house being the first to be built on the quarter section when it was built in 1909. So it was an old garage, but in actuality, it may have been a small barn with a loft. And in any case, it was one that needed some serious work by that time, like a new roof. So the day of shingling came, and Emmanuel had assembled a crack group of young assistants to work up on the roof. But being in his late 60s at that time, and obviously feeling much younger and sprier than his calendar years, Manny insisted on helping, with helping in quotation marks. Rather than coordinating things from the ground, he decided he would instead climb up the ladder and sit on the flat edge of the garage's roof parapet that you can see on the right side of the photograph. From that lofty vantage point, he could really be part of the action. So from the edge of the roof, he would kibitz with everybody and help pass bundles of shingles to the guys working further up the roof. Up to the roof the shingles came with the help of one assistant's young legs, and on to the roof parapet the bundles of shingles went. Manny, from his perch, would grab a stack of shingles, swivel, and pass this stack to the guys further up the roof. Grab a stack, swivel, and pass. Grab another stack, swivel, and pass. So the long afternoon summer passed right up until the very moment when Manny lost his balance. And almost in slow motion, off the roof, Manny went out into the thin summer air. Perhaps assisted by divine providence, Manny reached out into the blue summer sky and somehow, almost unbelievably, secured a tenuous grip on, wait for it, the power line that ran from the back of the house to the garage. The power line had been mounted on the backside of the house by a metal mast, and ripping from its anchors in the bricks, the metal mast bent under the weight of Manny's great good fortune. The power line sagged, it slackened, and it lowered him to the ground. And that day, Manny used at least 2 lives, escaping almost certain death from both gravity and from electrocution. So I'd also like to share with you one more story about in 1981, a Canada Day raft trip on the Bow River in Banff Park. Sometimes the spirit of adventure that gripped Manny's heart overpowered even his rational thought. Somehow, Emmanuel had convinced Donna that it would be a good bit of fun to take their 2 young boys, myself and Jeffrey, then aged 10 and 8, along with Joe, a man who worked for them at their motel, on an inflatable raft ride down the Bow River. Happy Canada Day, everyone. We set off on the Bow River near the motel, Baker Creek Bungalows in Banff Park. We were headed towards Castle Mountain Junction, only a few miles downstream, where Donna would patiently wait for our arrival, collect all the adventurers, and give everyone a ride back to the motel. A leisurely trip? Unfortunately, it was not to be. Missing from Manny's calculations was that the Bow River's height of flood and maximum speed of flow essentially coincides with the peak of the glacial runoff, occurring right around July 1st. So placid no more and calm no more, like the river was earlier in the year, the now swollen river raged and churned and swiftly bore away the little yellow raft towards disaster. Some ways down the river, the raft met its demise. Sweeping around the bend of an island, some gigantic tree had fallen, fully blocking the arm of the river like a massive gate arm at a railway crossing. The raft was shredded when it was swept into the fallen gigantic tree. The passengers of the raft were thrown into the water or dragged under the tree, and Manny, Joe, and myself somehow scrambled to a small island in the middle of the river. The raft, which was briefly caught by the fallen tree, was ripped free by the raging current, and then it raced downstream with Jeffrey clinging to its quarter-inflated remains. Trapped on the island were myself, Joe, and Emmanuel, frozen, drenched, but safe for the moment. Not yet knowing the fate of Jeffrey, Emmanuel braved the raging waters and actually swam across the swollen river, trying to get to the highway on the other side and summon help. Almost instantly, the waters took Emmanuel, and like that, he was gone out of view downstream. That very long summer day saw many remarkable things, and very luckily, all of us survived. Jeffrey was rescued miles downstream, aided by tourists who brought him into their warm camper after he pushed and swam his way to shore where the highway ran for a stretch alongside the river. Emmanuel, with a Herculean effort, ultimately reached the other side of the raging river, made it to the highway, and summoned help. The remaining island castaways, Joe and myself, were later rescued from our prison by a Parks Canada jet boat. And while Emmanuel only narrowly escaped the biggest danger of the day, being Donna's wrath, he bore the deep scars from the river's rocks and boulders on his legs to the end of his days. Thank you for letting me share just a couple of the many, many stories of Emmanuel's 9 lives. I will now pass the microphone to my dear brother, Jeffrey, who will share with you another adventure with Emmanuel.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to tell a quick story about an adventureful ride with Emmanuel. One day, long ago, Emmanuel and I were taking a trip to Airdrie in his Model A Ford. This was for testing the car just after an overdrive was installed. He insisted on making me drive so I could learn the new procedures to use the added gear. We traveled up Highway 2, going as fast as the overdrive transmission would let us go. That's about 60 miles an hour on a flat freeway, which is very fast for a car of that vintage. As we traveled the freeway, I heard a clunk. I asked Emmanuel, what was that metallic noise? He said, don't worry, just keep driving. A little time later, another clunk, and the response to me was the same, just keep driving. And then another. Imagine to our surprise when the 5th lug nut finally ejected itself from the wheel. Luckily, the car didn't flip over, nor did it swerve into the ditch. Instead, the 3-wheeled car ground to a halt on the driver's front axle, where it was missing one of its wheels. The wheel, freed from the lug nuts, launched itself ahead, rolling its way through traffic and bouncing across the highway median to the far ditch. Perhaps by the grace of God, it didn't hit another car, as it pass through oncoming traffic. It was a real life lesson on the importance of retorquing lug nuts after you work on the car. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael and Jeffrey, for these graphic tales with your father's near misses and fortunate outcomes, as well as for all of the many photos and collated information you both generously contributed. This brings us to the close of, shall we say, part one of the life and times of our beloved Emmanuel Manny Cohen, who left our midst at age 90. He was, as his obituary states, and we can all attest to, a devoted husband, father, and grandfather. He was gregarious, caring, and a lifelong volunteer for many causes and associations. He was also a proud member of Calgary's Jewish community, and he lived his life to the fullest, enjoying time spent with family and friends, skiing, sailing, flying airplanes, and yes, even taking chef courses. September 29th, 2020 was a sad day for us all, yet it is a privilege and an honor to pay tribute to this Gute Neshama, this righteous man who graced all our lives. We rather choose this day, February 17th, which would have been Manny's 92nd birthday, to remember and celebrate the life and times of this amazing man, collector and keeper of our regional and community histories, who has touched each of our lives in his own ways.
Some organizations measure their wealth in dollars, and we'd like to do that too, yet it's not our major focus. However, we do measure our wealth in the stories, the precious lives of the people in our community who have contributed and still contribute to the growth and expansion of who we are, where we come from, and by capturing and preserving and cherishing the past. The Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta, and it really is Southern Alberta because included tonight are members from Medicine Hat and Lethbridge, and we spoke of Waterton. The Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta gives a legacy and honor to these precious individuals and to their families. In essence, it's our tikkun olam, it's our mission, our reason for existence, persistence, and why we persevere with passionate determination. Manny was, in fact, one of the longest serving members of our organization, and his passion and thirst for unearthing and preserving the past for the future was second to none. His connections and information to the people, places, and events of the past and the present were priceless sources of reference that are simply irreplaceable. In Manny's words about the foundational years of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta,
well, it's a love of the lifestyle, participating, working with the nice people. And we're archiving things that are gone, they're already gone, and we have to gather what's remaining. And we're a very young society, whereas the people in Montreal, I've been doing a little work there, they have records of Jews from the late 1600s there. And someone took the time to gather this information. And if we don't gather the information of our grandparents, our parents, and even contribute ourselves, it'll be gone.
I also remember a pleasant hour that I spent with Manny pacing out the block where the old House of Jacob stood on 5th Avenue Southeast, so we could judge where a future interpretive plaque could go. And I still hear Manny's words to me at my father's Shiva: "You have big shoes to fill, big shoes." As Rabbi Jane spoke of so touchingly at the unveiling of Emmanuel's Matseva, or monument, it is now up to us to use the light that Emmy passed on to each of us in a positive way to build on the vast foundation Manny has provided for us, to each contribute our own voice, light, and effort to grow and influence others out of the great love and respect each of us have for Manny, for his memory, for his wealth of knowledge, and for his name. The ancient sages say that the greatest crowning achievement is to leave the legacy of a good name. Emmanuel, Emmy, Manuel, Manny achieved that many times over. Our memories now fill Manny's place in our lives, but his role in preserving, understanding, and communicating our history in this place now falls to us. We are leaving the last words to Emmanuel.
The only thing I'd like to add, I guess we all owe a debt to our grandparents and our parents for picking this beautiful country that we live in.
We owe Emmanuel a debt of gratitude for all that he has given to our society, our community, our province, and our lives. To all of you who have contributed to tonight's program, we thank you so much for all your assistance. Very instrumental in collating the materials and putting tonight's program together are Laura Schuler, Judy Chetner, Jeffrey and Michael Cohen, and the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta office staff for creating this PowerPoint and for coordinating all matters technical. Please consider becoming a member of the Jewish Historical Society if you aren't one already, and think about including this organization in your legacy giving so that we can continue to record, preserve, and communicate your life and the lives of your loved ones who've contributed so much to our community.
You will be able to view this program on the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta's website in due course. We'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening, and a special thank you to speakers Shari Cohen, Gary Kahn, Trudy Cowan, Irina Karschenbaum, Judy Chetner, and others for adding their voices and their cherished memories to our program.
A very, very special thank you goes out to our sponsors, Harriet and Phil Libben, whose generosity made this program possible. And to our two special guest moderators, Harry Sanders and Sheldon Smithens. Personally speaking, I know that both of you had a very special place for Manny in your hearts. And he would have agreed that you were the only two moderators that were perfect for this tribute. So blessings and gratitude. And before Harry and Sheldon sign off for the evening, I believe our wonderful president, Sandra Lipton, has a few words to say, and then she will be opening up the screen for everyone to have a little visit thereafter. Sandra, you have a few words, I believe, before our moderators sign off. Yes?
Yes. As soon as Harry and Sheldon sign off, I will open up everyone so that they're no longer forcibly muted. But I just wanted to thank so much everyone for joining us this evening, and I want to add my thanks to everyone who participated in creating and presenting this program. Your efforts on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta and in honor of Manny and all his contributions are so much appreciated. And I want to extend especially my deepest thanks to Laura and Judy for all the incredible work they put into putting this program together. And we are so grateful to have such dedicated members such as yourselves to support our activities, but also to pour your heart and soul into this particular event, honoring our former board member and special friend, Manny. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words, Sandra. So back to you, Harry and Sheldon, for your final words before we let everyone who have been muted be unmuted.
Sheldon?
Harry,
yeah.
Lila Tov, and blessings,
to you all. It was fun.